What is going on, y'all? KMBest here. Let's take a look at the best decks to climb in Marvel Snap. Baseline overview of the metagame is that without Invisible Woman first steps at the height of power that she was previously at, the overall points in this metagame have dropped a decent amount, and in a similar way, without Invisible Woman first steps providing the easiest deck to just jam a bunch of tech into, the overall tech in this metagame has dropped in sort of different kinds of ways. So the other thing that majorly happened is that a lot of decks that were relying on Mr. Fantastic ended up getting a decent amount worse, which means that the decks that were not relying on Mr. Fantastic as much got hit a lot less hard. So what you'll notice throughout this general overview of the metagame is that decks that hold on. How do I want to say this? In Marvel Snap, a lot of the time, things that are powerful by virtue of getting a fringe benefit from something else also being good. And so it's not to say that a lot of the decks that were running Mr. Fantastic aren't good in their own right, but they were extra good with Mr. Fantastic, whereas decks that were not relying on Mr. Fantastic are just as good as they were before, and that additional buff has been taken away from many of their competitors, which is a long way of saying Victoria Hand was already one of the best decks. It is definitely still one of the best decks, and is pretty easily my contender for the likely best deck in the game. There are a couple of things that you can argue about in terms of specific builds, but with Victoria Hand, a lot of things remain true build to build. Baseline, V-Hand Frigga, and of course, Misery Hood are the things that form the core of this deck. Various cards can go in and out depending on what you try to beat. I've actually been trying out a Killmonger in here depending on how it goes, but if you get Killmonger in here, you have to lose the Moon Girl stuff. The Moon Girl stuff means that your nut draws are really awesome and you end up being able to outpoint a lot of the stuff that you would otherwise having to be using the Killmonger to tech for, so it's kind of an interesting back and forth. Largely, though, just baseline, I think this is an incredibly safe pick. I normally don't try to speculate on nerfs in the future, but it's clear to me that they don't really see this deck as the problem that I think a lot of high infinite players see it as, given that they just buffed Misery recently. The general consensus among high infinite players on Misery going to 4-8 to 4-9 was, I don't think it matters too much, but it is kind of crazy that they would buff a card that good, and I think a lot of that is probably down to it is very likely that decks like this just simply don't perform as well in the larger segment of the population. I'm hoping that over time, people have improved and gotten better and started to realize what an absolute powerhouse this list really can be. Another really interesting thing that happens after patches is that a lot of packages that are good get identified pretty early, but they aren't necessarily optimized until people have a better idea of what the whole metagame actually starts to look like. And so a lot of decks that are just high on raw power, but low on specialization ability end up being quite good early in metagames. And we're definitely early in a metagame right now, being only a few days after the Thursday OTA. What that means is that a deck like Wiccan will likely fall off going into the future, but right now it's such a safe and complete package that it's very hard to go wrong. One of the things that keeps early metagames being the way that they are is that for people to find the true best decks, they often have to experiment a decent amount. Try to figure out what the right build of V-Hand is in the context of this metagame, because there are like flex slots that can be changed depending on what you're playing against. Try to figure out how Invisible Woman still works in the context of this metagame having lost some of the power that it had. That also matters a great deal. Trying to figure out how much Mr. Fantastic legitimately mattered to that deck also matters a great deal. And so you have these decks that are in flux that were previously a tier above stuff like Wiccan that aren't exactly fully figured out. And so that means that Wiccan, which is now using one of the few unnerfed, or I say now using, it's been doing this for months, really powerful combos to come out of Golden Gauntlet to reach high popularity. The Mercury Cannonball stuff. Like, Mercury Cannonball, like I said, it's been around the whole time. I've been abusing it the whole time. I feel like Golden Gauntlet demonstrated or created a massive rise in anti-Mercury Cannonball sentiment, and I can't really correlate that one-to-one with anything, but it feels like, to me, seeing Mercury Cannonball on that deck was like, all right, we're done here, everyone is mad at this now. And I think that that's basically true, but it's also basically been true for 2 months, and I don't really know why just now is doing it, but it is a very powerful strategy. Fenris Wolf, a very powerful part of that strategy, and you're gonna see a lot of Wolf, Gladiator, Mercury, Cannonball, Shang-Chi on this tier list. That combination of cards, in the absence of Invisible Woman, is extremely, extremely powerful. You can look at the Invisible Woman deck as a deck that was synergy-based, and in its synergy was able to go over the top of these good stuff decks and punish them. And I'm not so sure that that is true anymore. What I'm also not sure about is where exactly the archetype is supposed to go as it gets more specialized, because I would be willing to place a wager that the final build of this sort of interactive destroy your opponent's card pile probably doesn't actually involve Wiccan. I don't really think that it will. I think Wiccan is an artifact of it being early and that being a baseline strong card, and the deck is building for power now, as opposed to trying to figure out what the hell the other two cards in it are supposed to be. And when you look at a deck like this, you can really get the sense that the deck really doesn't know what it's supposed to look like. Is it supposed to go the direction of a mill deck? It can do that. Is it supposed to go the direction of a Lady Deathstrike Luna Snow Death deck? It can do that too. And so there's just a bunch of different stuff that this shell can support. Right now, thanks to Fudge, one of the most popular builds is the Morgan Le Fay build, which has a ton of final turn equity between cards like Killmonger and Gambit and Juggernaut. This allows you to put out large amounts of points in extremely confusing and interactive ways, while also using what I would consider to be a contender for the sort of best combination of cards in the game, that kind of package. You know what I'm talking about. Fenris Wolf, Negasonic, all of those cards can go in here, or can go out of here. But generally speaking, you have Fenris Gladiator Shang as the baseline, you have Mercury Cannonball additional, you have Negasonic as a potential inclusion as well, you have Killmonger as a potential inclusion, and those 7 cards plus some other stuff feels like something that's going to be really, really strong, but we don't know exactly what that is. Taking us back to Invisible Woman, who definitely did get worse, but I do think rumors of her demise are quite exaggerated. If anything, what's pushing against this deck right now is that some of those other decks playing Killmonger are becoming more and more popular, and this deck can count on ones. There are a couple different builds of this deck. I tried Marvel Boys stuff, I tried the one without Prodigy. I eventually came to the conclusion that I just couldn't figure out a better solution than running the exact same 12 cards I was running before the nerf, and it is worse, but it is also still quite good. I think that people are a little bit willing to overlook this kind of deck existing because it is notably weaker. Like, losing the Havoc stuff really matters. Getting your stuff blown out with various priority things, Negasonics and Juggernauts, it really matters. But having access to that stuff is also important. What really stuck out to me, though, is just how much this deck misses 2-cost Mr. Fantastic. That's definitely a flex slot right now. It really misses that card. Like, it is quite important to have a 2-cost. I've thought about replacing it with Herbie in much the same way as the replacement in the Victoria hand list. It is something, but it definitely doesn't feel nearly as smooth and powerful as when you had that guy at 2. The curve here is legitimately messed up. I honestly wonder if it's the kind of thing where they could put Human Torch at 2, but I don't actually think they're going to do that, nor am I even sure that would be worth investing in a deck like this because of the negative interaction that Human Torch First Steps has with multiple Invisible Women. There's the other build of this that Safety Blade has been championing, which is much more mid-rangey, no Prodigy, multiple additional 1-drops. I think it's lose Sunspot, add Black Cat, and then you get a Spider Ham in there, you get a Thing First Steps in there. It's just very much more mid-rangey, and to me, I feel like that is a similar space to Victoria Hand, but I would rather just be playing the Victoria Hand with some relevant tech than I would the specifically mid-rangey version. This package of cards that previously wasn't amazing with Mr. Fantastic, and I feel like that's sort of the crucial thing to emphasize here as to why there are so many of these Fenris Gladiator decks. It's that they were not, like, it's not like they hated Mr. Fantastic First Steps. He was really good. He was in these decks too. It's just they didn't do as much with him as all the stuff that really, really, really needed him, and they don't feel the loss of him in a meaningful way. They have a million other 2-drops they can play. So you even see decks like Mill, which is just generally regarded as kind of a meme deck, and it sort of is in the context that, like, Mill is not really about milling, it's about doing this other stuff, the Fenris package, in the context of sometimes randomly just beating the crap out of a combo deck, right? Like, this is a deck that can absolutely randomly just, like, take a Hela behind the woodshed by blowing up the Hela, or take a Mr. Negative behind the woodshed. All of those things, that's really the case for Mill, is the Mill is a way of giving your mid-range deck incidental tech against combo decks. And that's usually the case, the positive case for Mill when it's been good in the past. And I think it actually is pretty good right now, because there are some sort of weird combo decks running around, but mostly because the base package it's built around is so fundamentally powerful that you don't have to focus on milling your opponent. You could just focus on playing Marvel Snap cards and Cannonball Mercurying and Fenrising stuff, and all of that stuff is way, way, way stronger than playing Yondu, and you can just sort of play Yondu as well, which gives you this additional anti-combo ability. For a mid-rangey deck, this deck is honestly quite good into various combo stuff in ways that no other mid-range decks really are. I still believe that Cerebro 3 is a little bit underrated. It's been pretty consistently competitive across metagames since the buff. People have pretty consistently disrespected it, and it is generally just a deck that I think a lot of people at the top end of ladder have respect for, but not necessarily everywhere else. The deck is just solid, and yes, you can play it and feel terrible because it's a Cerebro deck. You cannot draw Cerebro, but when you really zoom out of being a Cerebro deck and look at every other card in this deck has every cringe card everyone hates in it, and I don't think people give it enough credit for being a deck that just has a ton of good cards in it. When we look at the advantage that Cerebro actually has, it's that it's the Cerebro deck that has the most legitimately good cards that are relevant in other contexts here. You have a bunch of things that are actually good. Cosmo Juggernaut, Killmonger Negasonic, actually good cards, and you are playing them in a world where they can get 6 additional power. It's just very reasonable. This is a straight up powerful deck that I think people need to stop looking at as a Cerebro deck and start looking at as a deck that plays those 4 cards, tries to cringe you out of the game. Like, honest to God, this deck reminds me more of the Kitty Pryde Agent Venom decks. Like, when people wonder where the Kitty Pryde Agent Venom decks went, I think mostly they got power crept by this. The decks, those decks were predicated on being like bounce decks that had these powerful 3s in it, right? Like Juggernaut and Cosmo in a bounce deck was sort of the pitch of the Agent Venom Thena Kitty Pryde decks. You can still do that, but you can also do that in Cerebro, and you're going to have more points. There's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff. You know what you should do is not let them do any of that stuff. Clog it up. You can absolutely still play Clog in this metagame. Yes, we are going to Cannonball Mercury in this shell as well. No, I don't particularly think Galactus First Steps is required, but I do think this is probably the most consistent and realistic home for Galactus First Steps. A legitimately interesting and powerful card without being overpowered. There's been a lot of discourse recently on make a season pass so strong that it then gets nerfed, and how that it constitutes a rug pull, and how they, quote, always do this. I feel as though the fact that Mr. Fantastic was bookended with Esme Cuckoo and Galactus First Steps is reasonable evidence that they do not, in fact, always do this. This guy is fine, but pretty far from problematic. If they nerf 5 other cards, maybe he could end up being the best 6-drop in the game, but he's right now just pretty good, and especially good in the context of, I need one guy that can win one lane, and Clog is the deck that asks for that the most consistently, and so here he is. I hate to say this, but it might actually be appropriate to remove Electra from the only deck playing Electra, and instead include Astral Projection. And largely that is so we can get double up on Cannonballs and double up on, of course, Spectrum. So this is basically Fox's list from the Golden Gauntlet. It is a fairly consistent points output list that frankly is mostly taking advantage of the fact that Enchantress just simply is not a real card right now. There are just very few people who see fit to put that card in the deck. I think one of the things that is underrated about a card like Stardust coming out is not necessarily that it's incredibly amazing, but that there is now more competition for every slot at the top of those decks. And when you look at decks that were meaningfully hurt by Mr. Fantastic's loss, decks that were playing a billion tech cards and relying on discounts in order to make it palatable when the tech cards weren't relevant, so they'd be, you know, a 4-7 or a 3-7 off of a surge or whatever, them losing a turn 2 Mr. Fantastic is like a really big deal, and that's another thing contributing to the relatively low Enchantress play rate here. But largely, it's just like, okay, what's the sort of dominant package right now? It's the Fenris Wolf package. And Fenris Wolf packages, well, they want to play stuff that kills your stuff. They want your stuff to die. They don't want it to sit on the board without ongoings. They want it to go away. And so you have this as a way of making sure that, you know, reminding people, hey, you gotta play Enchantress still if you want to be able to come. If you want to come for the, I don't know, Queen, you best not miss. And if you're missing Enchantress, you're probably gonna catch an L to this one. This is my favorite version of the move deck so far. It is a small ball move deck, which reminds me, again, I'm making this comparison a couple times, but it reminds me a lot of the sort of Thena decks that played old Havoc with Agent Venom and all of that. Because the pitch of those decks to me was always, I want to be able to play a deck with meaningful point output. I've got this like Thena stuff. I've got this Sage stuff. Just get me some numbers, and then I get to be Cosmo Juggernaut in a deck like that. And I think that for a while that was sort of largely locked to certain types of archetypes that could afford to be like that. When mid-range was sort of being defined by these big 4 costs, it was hard for them to fit that kind of stuff in there, turning off interactions in that way. And I think that this deck does a very good job of it. The thing is, there are other sort of cringe Cosmo Juggernaut decks too, and it has to do a better job than them. Like, let's say you're playing Invisible Woman with Cosmo Juggernaut. Is it doing that better? Like, these are in very similar spaces. What I did really like about this deck is just how incredibly unpredictable it is. I wanted to try to get a Heimdall in, but that would cost me my Cosmo Jug endgame, and at that point it becomes like, all right, why are we bothering? That said, this deck has a ton of game against a ton of stuff. It feels like a legitimately underrated shell right now, and as much as people were crying about how move is way worse, I kind of think there's something real here. This deck was hyped to high heaven by Denish, and I do think it is probably the best Hela deck. I don't particularly think it's lived up to its game-ruining promise, but it can absolutely ruin your queues if you run into it, depending on what you're playing. Now, yes, you get monstrously shut down by Stardust, who, yes, is a pretty reasonable tech card that you will, in fact, see some of the time, especially if people are playing exactly Safety Blade's list of the end of turn deck, which does run Stardust. This is a powerful deck, but it is sort of Mr. Negative-ish in that if you do the thing and you snap, and then they play the tech card that beats you, you lose. But if you do the thing and you snap and they don't play the tech card that beats you, you win. It's very much the Mr. Negative of Helas here, and it almost makes me wonder, I mean, if we're playing the Mr. Negative of Helas, why aren't we playing the Mr. Negative of Mr. Negatives? Or, like, discard. Like, it just kind of seems like this might be a metagame that's kind of ripe for a deck that doesn't get massively tech carded to death. Like, but there are a bunch of these, like, decks that are like, all right, what if we just say none of the tech cards exist, right? But you know what definitely doesn't exist right now is a deck that's playing all of the tech cards. So with the major threat in terms of point output, that being Invisible Woman, taken down a notch, I kind of think this could be a really good meta for either the typical discard deck with the Dakin combos in it, or for the Khonshu build. Like, I kind of think just having a strong, proactive game plan that isn't particularly specifically vulnerable to anything, but is just strong. There are things that are contextually good against it. There are things that are contextually not good against it. There are things you want to see and things you don't want to see, but just sort of a baseline. I kind of think both of these decks are very, very underrated right now. I don't necessarily have like, ooh, I've got hard facts and data to back this up, but this is a YouTube video about my tier list, and I'm just sitting here and I'm going to tell you, I think both discard decks are underrated. I think they are legitimately solid right now, and I think that recent metagame shifts away from decks full of entire tech cards in them, and towards decks that are sort of smaller on this interactive spectrum, but fundamentally will get outpointed by a lot of the stuff these decks do, I think this is kind of a reasonable spot to be in. Dexter got this deck in an email and tweeted it out, and now a bunch of people are playing it. I'm putting it on here largely because of the play rate, and I do think that this is a functional deck. You can definitely win with it. When I played it, it felt solid, it felt reasonable, but it didn't feel like something I would be like, all right, this is absolutely a banger. So we're going to use it to start out the honorable mentions section to point out where things that might have potential are going. The thing in this deck that strikes me the most is Terrax the Tamer is honestly just really good. That guy is honestly amazing. I'm kind of shocked they buffed him. It's a little bit strange to me that they did. But you have a deck here that plays for priority very, very powerfully, which allows very early Terraxes, which is very, very reasonable. A totally reasonable use case for this Quicksilver Domino thing. I felt like it was pretty solid, but you are kind of at the mercy of draws here. This deck will encourage you to cope stay. Oh, I shuffled 3 rocks in, I shuffled 4 rocks in. Surely they don't combo me. And if they do, they kind of just beat you. You don't have interaction to the level that you would want against a deck that is trying to combo you off. You're reliant on your disruption. And that can leave you in awkward spots where your opponent has a more complete knowledge of the game and you, doing the math, are incentivized to stay, but you don't know, and they do. I think this deck might also be underrated. It's a very confusing deck to play, which I think is a big point in its favor, actually, because when you play against it, it's like, what are they snapping on here? And it could be basically anything. There are so many different things that can happen when you play against a deck like this. The buff to White Tiger is cool, right? Like, you get extra points out of repeating it off of blowing up your White Tiger, things like that. That's not bad. Like, there's some legitimately cool interaction shenanigans that can happen here. I think a lot of cool things are applicable to what this deck can do. Like, final turn, I'm gonna Kid Omega my Sage, which applies the Sage buff to Kid Omega, because of the Sage power to Kid Omega, I should say, and then the Sage ability to a Fire Hair. That kind of stuff is cool. Like, there's some cool stuff that this deck can do, and I think largely a lot of the advantage it has is that it's doing stuff in a way that nobody is really familiar with. This looks like a pile, but I think when you zoom out of what it looks like and zoom into what it's actually doing, what it's doing is actually fairly consistent point output, and you need to play this deck as a deck that is a point output deck. There's not really like scams in here in the traditional sense. What you're doing is trying to put your cards together in a confusing way. What this honestly reminds me the most of is it's sort of like V-Hand. Like, that's what this is. It's just doing things in a different way. Scream is such a throwback because it's actually just 12 cards that are about the strategy, which I think is actually probably the weakness. This is a deck that plays cards that scale with themselves, right? It's important to have a quick density of the amount of cards that you need in order to make building around Scream justifiable. And I think that is largely the strength and weakness of this deck. The strength is that it's consistently doing what it wants to do. The weakness is that it lacks interaction against certain other decks, which makes it a very powerful predator of mid-range decks that don't have like over-the-top combos. Like, if your opponent does like V-Hand Frigga Moon Girl, you probably just don't ever beat that because the numbers they're doing are too stupid. But if your opponent is playing a much more reasonable mid-range draw, then you are very easily able to just bully them out of things by just being like, all right, here's all of my cards work together. They're all pretty good anyway. I'm getting this value plus some. It's a reasonable case for the deck existing, I think. But I don't know that it's a reasonable case for it sticking around long term because it is so capped on power thanks to the way that it's built. C2 is pretty good. It's just a pretty good deck. There has been a debate among high elo players recently as to whether or not you can include Blue Marvel, and I will give voice to that debate here. If nobody is playing Enchantress, you can play Blue Marvel. Like, that's basically it. The argument is so few people are playing Enchantress that it's just safe to play Blue Marvel now. And Blue Marvel is, and don't get me wrong about this, a legitimate upgrade to the deck in a world where Enchantress doesn't exist. It's just that if you do get your Blue Marvel Enchantress, you instantly lose the game. And the deck is strong enough to stand on its own without relying on that, but it is really nice to have a solid backup plan in this deck if you can get it in there. And so it's really just a question of how much Enchantress you see, because we are at a bit of a nadir. And if you don't see any of them, it is totally viable to get a Blue Marvel in here and have it be good. It's just also a risk. I am so appreciative of decks like this because they let me talk about my favorite Marvel character, Goon Knight, who is actually a canon Marvel character. Now, other than what I do on Friday evenings, Goon Knight is a very reasonable deck choice here, in large part because of the Agatha and Redshift stuff that you see in other lists. It's a very powerful implementation of it, but I really like it because of the disruption it applies to your opponent. This is a metagame that is full of individual cards with very high applicability and cards that combo with each other that aren't nearly as good without those things. So you get rid of their Mercury, that's very good in the world where they're trying to cannonball Mercury you. That kind of stuff is pretty damn strong. Downside, there's enough other people playing Fenris Wolf that if you discard an Agatha, you run the risk of them getting it back. I ran into, I want to say it was Gamer playing this, but now that I think about it, it probably wasn't. But someone I generally respect playing a list like this, and I thought it was actually pretty impressive in terms of output here. Again, though, this is sort of a relic of early metagame stuff where it's like, we don't exactly know what the high-end synergy stuff is. Everyone is still playing these sort of lower to the ground, fairer mid-range decks. And in a world where people are doing that, just being like, what's up? I'm cheating energy. I'm cheating big guys onto the board. Can you deal with all of them? It feels like there's a lot of like much more reasonable cases for playing one giant guy 3 days into a metagame as opposed to 3 weeks into a metagame. And that definitely shows here. It also shows here with Drac Dump. Again, a deck that's like very much more a 3-day into the metagame deck versus a 3-week into the metagame deck. But when you are those 3 days in, there's something to be said for proactive large numbers. And that's really what this deck is doing. It's going to make some big ass numbers. Can you deal with the big ass numbers? That's a very viable strategy right now in a world where people are no longer playing Havoc for 16 power. Last up, y'all know the deal. I actually kind of still am a little bit higher on Destroy than I think many other people are. Like, I know, I get it. But it's a functional deck when you do the thing you do. Like, you should be snapping Deadpool Agony. It's that good. When you are able to do something of that caliber, there's some really big numbers that can come out of it. Deadpool Agony can stand with any deck in the entire game right now. It's legitimately that strong. And we talk about how there's not really like a bunch of like high ceiling things happening right now. This is a deck that has a high ceiling and can really punish people who are low to the ground by just doing some really stupid ass numbers. Downside, because a lot of the time what you'll be doing is like trying to lose priority in order to final turn Deadpool null, things like that, you end up notably vulnerable to Juggernaut strategies, and there's still people playing Cosmo too. All right, y'all. Thank you so much for watching. As always, I've been KMBest. You have been phenomenal. Nothing can change that, and I will see you in the next one.